You're listening to Tales of Vatican Secrets, and if you found your way here, wherever you are in the world right now, I'm glad you're listening. Maybe it's late evening where you are, maybe it's already deep into the night, maybe you're winding down or just beginning to rest. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because this channel shares a new story every single day. And tonight's story isn't about legends or whispers or things that might have happened in shadow. Tonight we're going to talk about something specific, something that actually changed the way the Vatican kept its records, documented its history, and controlled what could and could not be known. This is about a decision, a real one, made by real people in a real place. And if you keep listening, you're going to understand exactly how it worked, why it mattered, and what it meant for everyone who came after. So let me ask you, which country are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Because once we begin, once you start to see how this system was built, you won't want to stop halfway through. You're going to want to know how it ends. You cross a threshold tonight, and you're walking into something that reshaped how the church handled its own memory, its own truth, and its own silence. Let's begin. You're standing in your mind in the year 1881, and you're looking at a decision that Pope Leo XIII made that year. A decision that seems, on the surface, like an act of openness, because in 1881, Pope Leo XIII issued a formal instruction that the Vatican Secret Archives, known in Latin as the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, would be open to qualified scholars for the first time in the institution's history. The word secret here didn't mean hidden in the conspiratorial sense. It meant private, belonging to the Pope, the personal archive of the papacy. But the effect had always been the same. No outsider, no historian, no researcher from any university or nation had been allowed inside to examine the documents that the Church had been collecting, organizing, and sealing away for centuries. And so when Leo XIII announced that the archives would open, it was celebrated. It was seen as a gesture of transparency, a willingness to let history speak for itself. But that's not the whole story, because what Leo XIII actually did was far more controlled, far more calculated, and far more effective at shaping what could be known than simply keeping the doors locked. What he did was create a system of access that appeared open but was built on a foundation of selective cataloging, pre-approved research topics, and a bureaucratic structure so dense and so deliberate that it determined not just who could see the documents, but which documents could be seen at all. The decision to open the archives in 1881 wasn't a single moment. It was the beginning of a process, a long, carefully managed process that would take decades to implement. And the first thing you need to understand is where this decision was made and what the physical reality of the Vatican Secret Archives actually looked like at that time. The archives were not housed in a single grand hall. They were scattered across multiple locations within Vatican City, stored in rooms that had been accumulating documents since the early medieval period. Some materials kept in the Tower of the Winds, a structure built in the late 16th century under Pope Gregory XIII, originally designed as an astronomical observatory, but later repurposed as storage space for particularly sensitive papal correspondence. Other documents were kept in corridors beneath the Vatican Palace itself, in stone rooms with vaulted ceilings, no windows, and air that stayed cold and dry year-round, perfect for preservation, but difficult to navigate, difficult to catalog, and almost impossible to search systematically unless you already knew what you were looking for. By 1881, the Vatican had been accumulating records for more than 1,000 years. Letters from kings, decrees from councils, trial transcripts from Inquisition proceedings, diplomatic correspondence, financial ledgers, theological rulings. And the problem wasn't that these documents didn't exist. The problem was that no one outside the Church's inner administration knew how they were organized, what classification systems had been used, or whether certain documents had been deliberately excluded from the catalogs altogether. Pope Leo XIII understood this, and his decision to open the archives was not a surrender of control, it was a reassertion of it, because the way you control historical knowledge is not by locking it away entirely. That creates suspicion, rumors, conspiracy theories that grow stronger the longer the doors stay closed. The way you control historical knowledge is by opening the doors just enough to let in a controlled amount of light, and then you decide where that light falls. The institutional mechanism Leo XIII put in place was a formal cataloging system, and it was introduced gradually, beginning in the 1880s and continuing well into the 20th century, overseen by a newly established office within the Vatican administration, the prefect of the Vatican Secret Archives, a position that reported directly to the Cardinal Secretary of State, which meant that every decision about what got cataloged, how it got classified, and who got access to it was subject to approval at the highest levels of church governance. The cataloging system itself was based on a classification method that divided documents into major series, called fondi in Italian, each series corresponding to a particular papal administration, a particular Vatican office, or a particular historical period. And within each series, documents were assigned reference numbers that indicated their location, their subject matter, and their level of sensitivity. Some documents were classified as freely accessible, meaning that any qualified scholar who applied for a research permit could request to see them. Other documents were classified as restricted, meaning they required special permission from the prefect, and that permission was granted only if the researcher could demonstrate a legitimate academic reason for access and could provide references from established institutions that vouched for their character and discretion. And then there were documents that were not classified at all, documents that existed physically in the archives but had no catalog entry, no reference number, no official acknowledgement that they were there, and these documents remained effectively invisible, accessible only to Vatican archivists who knew where to look and had the authority to retrieve them. This is the mechanism, this is the system that Leo set in motion, and it's important to understand that it wasn't arbitrary, it was strategic. Because the goal wasn't to hide everything. The goal was to control the narrative, to allow certain kinds of research while quietly discouraging others, to make it possible for historians to write about the Church's past in ways that reinforced its legitimacy while making it nearly impossible for them to write about the parts of that past that raised uncomfortable questions. The verifiable historical anchor here is not just the opening of the archives in 1881, it's the fact that this opening came at a very specific moment in European history, a moment when the Church was under intense pressure from secular governments, from anti-clerical movements, from nationalist historians who were using archives in other countries to challenge the Church's version of medieval and early modern history. In Italy, the newly unified Italian state had seized the Papal States in 1870, and the Pope had retreated behind the walls of the Vatican, declaring himself a prisoner, and one of the arguments being made by Italian nationalists was that the Church had been a corrupt political power, that it had manipulated history, that it had destroyed evidence, and by opening the archives, Leo XIII was able to respond to those accusations, not by denying them outright, but by saying, in effect, "Come and see for yourselves, we have nothing to hide." And when historians did come, when they were granted access and they began to publish their findings, many of those findings were indeed favorable to the Church. Or at least they were not as damaging as the anti-clerical critics had hoped. And that wasn't because the historians were dishonest. It was because the documents they were allowed to see had been carefully selected, carefully cataloged, and carefully framed in a way that guided their research toward conclusions that the Church could live with. The real consequence of this decision, the consequence that historians are still grappling with today, is that it created a historiographical problem, a problem of trust, because once you establish a system where access is controlled, where certain documents are cataloged and others are not, where permissions are granted based on institutional approval and discretion, you introduce a fundamental uncertainty into the historical record. And that uncertainty never goes away, even if later popes decide to open more sections of the archives, even if more documents are cataloged and classified. There is always the question of what remains uncatalogued, what remains classified, what has been quietly removed or relocated or reclassified in ways that make it harder to find. And this is not speculation. This is something that Vatican archivists themselves have acknowledged in private conversations with researchers, that the catalog is not complete, that there are documents that exist, but are not listed, that the system was designed from the beginning not to be transparent but to appear transparent, and appearance, in this case, was enough to change how the Church's history was written for more than a century. Welcome to Tales of Vatican Secrets. If you're listening to this late at night, wherever you are in the world, I'm glad you found your way here. Maybe you're in Brazil, maybe you're in the Philippines, maybe somewhere else entirely. I'd love to know which country you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. If stories like this one interest you, consider subscribing, because what we're going to talk about tonight isn't vague mystery or atmosphere for its own sake. This is about real documents, real decisions, real systems that changed how the Church kept its records, and real consequences that researchers are still discovering today. Once you understand what happened, you'll see the Vatican archives differently. There's no turning back from that. You need to understand what happened in the years immediately after 1881, because the opening of the Vatican Secret Archives wasn't a single event. It was a process that unfolded slowly, carefully, and with a level of bureaucratic precision that most people outside the Vatican never saw. The first scholars who were granted access, starting in 1883 and 1884, were not random academics. They were carefully vetted individuals, many of them Catholic historians with established reputations, men who had already published work that demonstrated their loyalty to the Church, or at least their willingness to approach Church history with sympathy and respect. The application process itself was designed to filter out anyone who might be hostile, anyone who might use the documents to undermine the Church's authority. And this filtering happened through a series of formal requirements that seemed reasonable on the surface, but had the effect of excluding entire categories of researchers. You had to submit a detailed research proposal explaining exactly what you wanted to study, which time period, which papal administration, which specific documents you hoped to examine, and this proposal had to be reviewed by the prefect of the archives, who had the authority to approve it, reject it, or ask for modifications. You had to provide letters of recommendation from established scholars, preferably from Catholic universities or institutions with close ties to the Church. And these letters had to vouch not just for your academic qualifications, but for your character, your discretion, your trustworthiness. You had to demonstrate that you had the necessary language skills, because most of the documents were in Latin, medieval Latin, ecclesiastical Latin, sometimes in Italian, sometimes in other languages depending on the correspondence, and you had to prove that you could read paleography, the handwriting styles used in different centuries, because without that skill, you wouldn't be able to decipher the documents, even if they were placed in front of you. And then, once you were approved, once you were granted a research permit, you were not given free access to wander through the archives. You were assigned to a specific reading room, the Sala di Studio, a room located on the upper floor of a building that had been constructed specifically for this purpose in the late 19th century, a room with long wooden tables, high windows that let in natural light during the day, and shelves along the walls where reference catalogs were kept. And you would sit at one of those tables and you would submit a written request for the specific documents you wanted to see. And an archivist would go into the closed stacks, retrieve the documents, bring them to you, and you would examine them under supervision, always under supervision, because you were never allowed to be alone with the materials. And when you were finished, you would return the documents to the archivist, and they would be taken back into the closed stacks, and you would have no way of knowing whether the documents you had requested were all the documents that existed on that topic, or whether other documents, related documents, more revealing documents, had been quietly set aside, kept in a different location, cataloged under a different reference number, or not cataloged at all. This is the physical reality of research in the Vatican Secret Archives, and it remained essentially unchanged for decades, well into the 20th century. And what it meant was that even though the archives were technically open, the system of access was designed to control not just who could enter, but what they could discover once they were inside. The institutional mechanism that made this possible was the catalog itself, the inventario, a multi-volume reference system that listed the documents held in each series, each fondo, and provided brief descriptions of their contents. But the inventario was not comprehensive, it was selective, and the decisions about what to include in the catalog and what to leave out were made by Vatican archivists who understood very clearly that the catalog was not just a research tool, it was a control mechanism. Some documents were cataloged with detailed descriptions that made it easy for researchers to find them and understand their significance. Other documents were cataloged with vague descriptions, one-line summaries that didn't indicate what they actually contained. And if you didn't already know what you were looking for, if you didn't have prior knowledge from some other source that a particular document existed and was important, you might request it and discover that it was something entirely different from what the catalog description suggested, or you might never request it at all because the description didn't seem relevant to your research. And then there were documents that appeared in the catalog but were marked as restricted, and when you requested them, you would be told that you needed special permission, and when you applied for that permission, you might be asked to justify why you needed to see those particular documents, what academic purpose they would serve, and whether there were other documents, less sensitive documents, that could serve the same purpose. And this process of justification, this back-and-forth negotiation with the prefect's office, could take weeks, sometimes months, and by the time you received a decision, you might have run out of time. Your research grant might have expired, your fellowship might have ended, and you would have to leave Rome without ever seeing the documents you came for. This is not speculation. This is documented in the private correspondence of historians who worked in the Vatican archives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and some of them wrote about it openly, expressing frustration with the system, while others wrote about it more carefully, more diplomatically, because they knew that if they criticized the church too openly, they might lose their access entirely. They might find that their next application for a research permit was quietly denied. And so they learned to work within the system, to accept its limitations, to focus on the documents they could access, and avoid asking too many questions about the documents they couldn't. The verifiable historical anchor here is the case of Ludwig von Pastor, a German Catholic historian who became one of the first major scholars to gain extensive access to the Vatican secret archives in the 1880s and 1890s, and who used that access to write a massive, multi-volume history of the popes, the Geschichte der Päpste, which was published over several decades and became one of the standard reference works on papal history. Pastor was granted extraordinary access, more access than almost any other researcher of his time, and this was not because his research was more important or more rigorous than others. It was because he had cultivated close relationships with Vatican officials, because he had demonstrated his loyalty to the Church, and because his work, while scholarly and detailed, was always framed in ways that portrayed the papacy in a favorable light, or at least in a defensible light. Even when dealing with controversial topics like the Renaissance popes, the Inquisition, or the Church's response to the Protestant Reformation. Pastor's work is still cited today. It's still considered valuable, but historians have noted that his access to the archives was not neutral. It was privileged, and that privilege came with expectations, unspoken expectations about how the material would be used, how it would be interpreted, and what conclusions would be drawn, and Pastor understood those expectations and worked within them, and in return he was given access that other historians, more critical historians, less sympathetic historians, were quietly denied. This creates a historiographical problem, because when you're reading a work of history that's based on archival research, you're assuming that the historian had access to all the relevant documents, or at least to a representative sample of the relevant documents. But in the case of the Vatican archives, that assumption is not safe because the system was designed to give different historians access to different materials based on judgments about their trustworthiness, their perspective, their likely conclusions. And this means that the history that got written, the history that became the standard account, the accepted narrative, was shaped not just by what the documents said, but by which documents were made available and to whom. And this pattern continued well into the 20th century through multiple papal administrations, because the decision Leo XIII made in 1881 wasn't just about opening the archives. It was about establishing a system, a model for how the Church would manage its historical legacy. And that system proved remarkably durable, remarkably resistant to change, even as the world outside the Vatican changed dramatically. Even as historical methods evolved, even as the standards for archival access in other countries became more open, more transparent, more egalitarian, the Vatican maintained its system of selective access, selective cataloging, and selective disclosure. And it did so not through explicit censorship, not through burning documents or denying that they existed, but through the quieter, more subtle method of controlling the infrastructure of access itself, the catalogs, the reference systems, the application procedures, the reading room rules, all of it designed to create the appearance of openness while preserving, at the core, the Church's ability to control what could be known, what could be proven, and what would remain, if not secret, then at least obscure, difficult to find, difficult to verify, and therefore difficult to use as evidence against the Church's preferred version of its own history. The real consequence, the consequence that matters for understanding how this decision rewrote Church record-keeping, is that it established a precedent, a model that would be followed for the next century and beyond, a model that said you could appear transparent without actually being transparent. You could open your archives without surrendering control. You could allow research without allowing accountability. And this model worked. It worked extraordinarily well because it satisfied the critics who demanded access. It satisfied the historians who wanted to believe they were doing objective research. And it protected the Church from the kind of systematic, unrestricted examination that might have revealed patterns, connections, cover-ups, and institutional failures that the Church preferred to keep out of public view. And some historians quietly disagree about whether this was deliberate policy or simply the inevitable result of bureaucratic caution, but the effect was the same either way. The historical record was shaped, managed, and controlled, and it happened not in darkness, but in the carefully lit reading rooms of the Vatican Secret archives, where scholars sat at wooden tables, turning pages of centuries-old documents, believing they were uncovering the truth, never quite realizing that the truth they were uncovering had already been curated, filtered, and prepared for exactly this kind of discovery. You're moving deeper now, and what you need to see next is how this system evolved through the early 20th century, because the model that Leo XIII established in 1881 didn't remain static. It adapted, it became more sophisticated, and it did so in response to specific historical pressures that forced the Vatican to reconsider not whether to control access, but how to control it more effectively. The critical moment came during the pontificate of Pope Pius VI, who served from 1903 to 1914, and who initiated a major reorganization of the Vatican's administrative structure, including the archives. And this reorganization wasn't driven by a desire for transparency. It was driven by a recognition that the existing system was becoming unwieldy, that the archives were growing faster than they could be cataloged, that documents were being stored in too many different locations, and that even Vatican officials themselves were having difficulty locating specific materials when they needed them for diplomatic or legal purposes. Pius X appointed a commission to study the problem, and that commission, working between 1904 and 1908, produced a detailed report that identified several specific issues. First, that the physical storage conditions in some of the older archive rooms were deteriorating, with documents at risk from humidity, temperature fluctuations, and in some cases rodent damage. Second, that the cataloging system was inconsistent, with different archivists using different classification methods, making it nearly impossible to search across multiple series or time periods. And third, that there was no clear policy about what should be archived and what could be discarded, which meant that some trivial administrative documents were being preserved, while potentially important correspondence was being lost or destroyed without proper review. The Commission's solution was to create a new centralized archive building, a purpose-built structure that would bring together materials that had been scattered across multiple Vatican locations, and this building, known as the Archivio Segreto Vaticano building, was constructed over several years and opened in 1910, and it was designed with specific features that reflected the Vatican's priorities. Climate-controlled storage rooms with regulated temperature and humidity, metal shelving systems that could accommodate the weight of thousands of bound volumes, a dedicated conservation workshop for repairing damaged documents, and a new, expanded reading room for researchers, the Sala di Studio Nuova, which could accommodate more scholars, but which also included a raised platform at one end where an archivist could sit and observe everyone in the room simultaneously, ensuring that no one removed pages from documents, made unauthorized copies, or accessed materials they weren't supposed to see. The physical element here is crucial because the architecture of the building itself was designed to enforce control. The layout of the rooms, the placement of the doors, the sight lines from the archivist's platform, all of it designed to create an environment where researchers felt they were being granted a privilege, not exercising a right, and where the Vatican's authority over the materials was constantly, physically present. The institutional mechanism that accompanied this physical reorganization was a new cataloging standard introduced in 1912, which required that every document entering the archives be assigned a unique reference code, a combination of letters and numbers that indicated the series it belonged to, the year it was created, the office that produced it, and its position within the collection. And this system, called the Rubricella system, was more detailed than the previous inventario, more precise, and in theory more useful for researchers. But it also had a feature that hadn't been present in earlier catalogs. It included a classification field that marked certain documents as riservato, reserved, meaning they were cataloged and their existence was acknowledged. But they were not available for research without explicit permission from the Cardinal Secretary of State, not just the prefect of the archives, and that permission was granted only in exceptional circumstances. And the criteria for what made circumstances exceptional were never publicly defined. This meant that a researcher could be sitting in the reading room, looking at the catalog, and they could see that a document existed, they could see its reference code, they could see a brief description of its contents, but they could also see that it was marked riservato, and they would know immediately that there was no realistic possibility of accessing it unless they had extraordinary institutional connections, or unless their research was being conducted with the explicit support of the Vatican itself. This is a different kind of control than simply hiding documents, because it allows the Vatican to acknowledge that sensitive materials exist while still preventing anyone from examining them. And it creates a psychological effect, a sense that the really important information, the really revealing documents, are just out of reach, visible but untouchable. And this sense of proximity without access can be more frustrating, more demoralizing to researchers than complete secrecy would be. Because complete secrecy allows you to imagine that maybe the documents don't exist, maybe the archive doesn't have anything important. But when you can see that the documents are there, cataloged and classified and sitting in a storage room somewhere in the building, and you're being told that you simply cannot see them, it reinforces the hierarchy. It reminds you that the Vatican is in control, not you, and that the terms of access are theirs to set, not yours to negotiate. The verifiable historical anchor for this period is the First World War, which broke out in 1914, just a few years after the new archive building opened. And during the war years, the Vatican secret archives were effectively closed to all but a handful of researchers because the Vatican was trying to maintain its neutrality, trying to position itself as a potential mediator between the warring powers, and it could not afford to have historians digging through diplomatic correspondence, looking for evidence of Vatican sympathies or connections that might compromise that neutrality. When the archives reopened after the war in 1919, under Pope Benedict XV, the rules had been tightened. The application process had become more stringent, and there was a new requirement that researchers had to sign a formal declaration stating that they would not publish anything based on their research without first submitting their manuscript to the Vatican for review. And this review process, called the imprimatur process in some cases or simply referred to as a courtesy review in others, gave the Vatican the ability to request changes, to suggest alternative interpretations, or in extreme cases, to deny permission to publish altogether. And while most researchers complied with this requirement because they had no choice, because refusing would mean losing their access, there were a few who objected, who argued that this was a violation of academic freedom, and those researchers found that their applications for future research permits were quietly denied. Their names were flagged in the prefect's office, and they were effectively blacklisted from Vatican archives for years, sometimes permanently. This is documented in the correspondence of the American historian Henry Charles Lea, who had written extensively about the Inquisition in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and who applied for access to Vatican archives in the 1920s, hoping to expand his research, and his application was rejected, not with a detailed explanation, but with a brief note saying that the materials he wished to examine were not available for consultation at that time. And Lea understood that this was not a temporary restriction, it was a permanent exclusion, and he wrote about it bitterly in letters to colleagues, saying that the Vatican's so-called open archives were a facade, that the Church was still hiding the evidence of its worst abuses, and that historians who wanted access had to essentially become apologists, had to agree, implicitly or explicitly, not to challenge the Church's narrative too directly. Lea's case is important because it shows that the system wasn't just about controlling access. It was about controlling interpretation, about ensuring that even when documents were made available, they would be used in ways that supported, or at least didn't fundamentally undermine, the Church's authority and legitimacy, and this meant that the history being written about the Church, even by serious scholars working with primary sources, was always to some degree a negotiated history, a history shaped by what the Church was willing to reveal and what researchers were willing to say in order to maintain their access. The real consequence of this period from roughly 1910 to 1930, was that it normalized the idea that Vatican archives were different from other archives, that they operated according to different rules, that access was a privilege rather than a standard scholarly right, and that historians working with Vatican materials had to accept certain constraints that they wouldn't accept anywhere else. And this normalization happened gradually, not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of small decisions, procedural requirements, bureaucratic hurdles, and the quiet exclusion of researchers who pushed too hard or asked the wrong questions. And by the 1930s, when Pius XV was Pope, the system was so well established, so institutionally embedded, that it seemed natural, inevitable, simply the way things were done, and even historians who were critical of the Church, even those who suspected that important documents were being withheld, had learned to work within the system, to focus on what they could access, to avoid direct confrontation, and to frame their findings in ways that acknowledged the Church's sensitivity about certain topics. And this accommodation, this learned caution, became part of the professional culture of historians working on Catholic Church history, and it remains part of that culture today, though few historians like to talk about it openly, because acknowledging it means acknowledging that the historical record they're working with is not just incomplete, it's strategically incomplete, shaped by institutional decisions about what can be known and what must remain obscure. And that's a difficult thing to admit when your professional reputation depends on the claim that you're doing objective, empirical research based on primary sources. You're halfway through now, and what comes next is perhaps the most revealing part of this entire story, because it's when the system that had been built over decades was tested in ways the Vatican hadn't fully anticipated. And the test came not from hostile scholars or anti-clerical governments, but from within the Catholic historical community itself, from researchers who were loyal to the Church, who believed in its mission, but who also believed that honest history required access to uncomfortable truths, and the tension between those two commitments, loyalty and honesty, created a crisis that forced the Vatican to refine its control mechanisms even further. The period we're looking at now is the 1940s and 1950s, the years during and immediately after the Second World War, and this was a time when questions about the Vatican's role during the war, about Pope Pius XII's response to the Holocaust, about the Church's relationship with fascist governments in Italy and Germany, were beginning to emerge, not yet in the explosive way they would in the 1960s with the publication of Rolf Hochhuth's play The Deputy, but quietly, in academic circles, in private conversations among historians who had access to documents in other archives, in government archives, in captured German records, and who were noticing gaps, silences, unexplained decisions, and who wanted to cross-reference those materials with Vatican sources to understand what the Church had known, when it had known it, and why it had responded the way it did. The Vatican secret archives remained closed throughout the war years. That's the first thing you need to understand. Closed completely. No researchers allowed, no exceptions. And this wasn't unusual. Many archives in Europe were closed during the war for security reasons. But what was unusual was how slowly the Vatican reopened after the war ended. And when access was finally restored in 1946, it came with new restrictions that hadn't existed before. Specifically a rule that documents from pontificates could only be consulted after a certain number of years had passed since the end of that pontificate. And initially that period was set at 75 years, which meant that in 1946, researchers could only access documents up to the year 1871, the end of the pontificate of Pius IX, and nothing from the 20th century, nothing from the First World War, nothing from the interwar period, and certainly nothing from the Second World War, or the pontificate of Pius XIV, who was still serving as Pope. This rule, the 75-year rule, became the primary mechanism through which the Vatican controlled access to its most sensitive modern materials, and it was justified on the grounds that diplomatic correspondence and confidential communications required a long period of confidentiality to protect the privacy of individuals mentioned in the documents and to avoid interfering with ongoing political relationships. But the effect was to create a moving barrier, a chronological wall that always stayed roughly 3/4 of a century behind the present, and that meant that the most controversial periods of church history, the periods that contemporary historians most wanted to study, were always just out of reach, always protected behind that barrier, and by the time the barrier moved forward enough to allow access, the immediate historical context had changed. The people involved were mostly dead. The political circumstances were different, and the urgency of the questions had diminished. The physical element that matters here is a specific storage area within the Vatican Secret Archives building, a section known informally among archivists as the Sala Riservata, the reserved room located in the basement level of the building, accessible only through a locked door that required a key held by senior archive staff. And this room contained documents that had been separated from the main collection. Documents that were considered too sensitive even to appear in the catalog with a riservato marking. Documents that officially did not exist in any public inventory, but that Vatican officials knew were there and could retrieve when necessary for internal purposes, for preparing official statements, for responding to diplomatic inquiries, or for providing background information to church historians who were writing authorized biographies or institutional histories. The existence of this room was not acknowledged publicly until decades later. It was mentioned occasionally in the private memoirs of retired Vatican officials, and it was confirmed in interviews with former archive staff. But during the 1940s and 1950s, researchers who suspected that such a room existed had no way to prove it, no way to request access, no way even to ask about it directly without risking the loss of whatever limited access they did have. This is the kind of structural secrecy that's most effective because it operates below the level of explicit denial. The Vatican never had to say, "We are hiding documents." They simply organized their archive in such a way that certain categories of material never entered the visible system, never appeared in the catalogs that researchers could consult, and therefore never became the subject of access requests. And this meant that historians working in the archives could spend months or years examining the documents they were allowed to see, and they could come away believing they had done comprehensive research, never knowing that a parallel collection existed that might have completely changed their understanding of the topic they were studying. The institutional mechanism that made this sustainable was the professionalization of the Vatican archive staff itself, because by the mid-20th century, the people working in the archives were not just clerics assigned to administrative duties, they were trained archivists, many of them with advanced degrees in history or paleography. People who understood archival theory, who knew international standards for document preservation and access, and who were in many cases personally sympathetic to the idea of greater openness, but who also understood that their primary loyalty had to be to the institution, to the Church, and that their role was not to facilitate unrestricted research, but to manage access in ways that protected the Church's interests while maintaining the appearance of scholarly cooperation. These archivists became gatekeepers in the most literal sense. They were the ones who decided how to interpret the access rules. They were the ones who retrieved documents from storage and brought them to researchers. They were the ones who noticed when a researcher was getting too close to sensitive material and who would suggest, politely, that perhaps a different set of documents might be more useful, or who would point out that the documents the researcher wanted were unfortunately not yet available because they fell outside the 75-year window, or who would explain that certain materials had been temporarily removed for conservation work and couldn't be consulted at present. And these explanations were rarely questioned because researchers had no way to verify them. No way to know whether the documents were really under conservation or whether they were sitting in the sala riservata, deliberately withheld. The verifiable historical anchor here is the case of the Jesuit historian Robert Leiber, who served as a close assistant to Pope Pius X, and who, after Pius X's death in 1958, was granted extraordinary access to papal correspondence from that pontificate for the purpose of preparing a defense of Pius XII's wartime record, and Leiber was allowed to see documents that no other historian could see. He was allowed to work in areas of the archive that were completely off limits to outside researchers, and he was given permission to publish excerpts from materials that were still decades away from being opened under the normal access rules. But the condition of this access was that his work would be conducted under the supervision of Vatican officials, that his interpretations would be reviewed before publication, and that his ultimate goal was not objective historical analysis, but advocacy, the defense of a pope whose reputation was beginning to be questioned. Leiber's work, published in the late 1950s and early 1960s, became one of the primary sources that other historians relied on when writing about Pius X, because he was the only one who had seen the actual documents. And this created a strange situation where the accepted historical narrative about one of the most controversial periods in church history was based not on independent research, but on the carefully curated findings of a historian who was working, essentially, as a Vatican spokesman. And this pattern, this use of privileged access to shape historical interpretation, became a standard Vatican strategy, one that would be repeated in later decades whenever the Church faced historical controversies that required a response. The strategy was to grant selective access to trusted historians, allow them to see documents that others couldn't see, and then present their work as definitive, as based on the fullest possible examination of the evidence, even though that examination was never truly independent and never truly comprehensive. The real consequence of this period was that it established a two-tier system of historical knowledge about the modern church. There was the history that could be written by outside researchers working with limited access and incomplete documentation. And there was the history that could be written by insiders, by historians with institutional connections, with Vatican approval, with access to the Sala Riservata and other restricted collections. And these two histories didn't always contradict each other, but they emphasized different things. They drew different conclusions, and most importantly, they created different levels of confidence, because the inside historians could always claim that they had seen documents that the outside historians hadn't seen, that they knew things the outsiders didn't know, and that their interpretations were therefore more authoritative. And this claim was impossible to refute because the documents in question remained sealed, unavailable for independent verification. And so the argument became circular. The Vatican's version of events was said to be the most accurate because it was based on the fullest access to documents, and access to documents was controlled by the Vatican based on whether researchers would support the Vatican's version of events. And this circularity, this closed loop of access and interpretation, became one of the most effective tools the Church had for managing its historical reputation. More effective than censorship, more effective than denial, because it allowed the Church to engage with historical criticism, to appear responsive to scholarly inquiry, while actually maintaining complete control over what could be definitively known and what would remain a matter of speculation, debate, and ultimately unresolvable controversy. You're in the deep part now, and what happened next is where the entire system almost broke open, almost collapsed under its own contradictions, because by the 1960s and 1970s, the world outside the Vatican had changed in ways that made the old model of controlled access increasingly difficult to maintain. And the change came from multiple directions at once, from the Second Vatican Council, which met from 1962 to 1965, and which created an expectation of greater openness and transparency within the Church. From the cultural shifts of the 1960s that questioned traditional authority structures. From the professionalization of historical scholarship, which was adopting new methodological standards that emphasized archival completeness and source criticism, and from the emergence of specific controversies, specific accusations about the Church's wartime conduct, about its financial dealings, about its handling of sexual abuse by clergy, accusations that couldn't be fully investigated because the documentary evidence remained locked behind the 75-year rule and the various other restrictions that governed access to Vatican materials. The pressure built gradually, and it came not just from secular historians, but from Catholic historians, from scholars who taught at Catholic universities, who attended Mass regularly, who considered themselves faithful members of the Church, but who also believed that the Church's credibility depended on its willingness to confront its own history honestly. And these historians began to organize, to form professional associations, to publish articles and books that explicitly criticized the Vatican's archival policies. And by the early 1970s, there was a small but vocal movement within Catholic intellectual circles calling for the Vatican to reduce the 75-year restriction, to open materials from the 20th century, and specifically to open the archives of Pius X's pontificate, which had ended in 1958 and which, according to critics, contained evidence that would clarify once and for all whether the Pope had done enough to resist the Holocaust, whether he had maintained secret communications with Nazi officials, whether he had prioritized diplomatic neutrality over moral witness. And these were not abstract historical questions. They were questions that went to the heart of the Church's moral authority. And the longer they remained unanswered, the more damage they did to the Church's reputation, particularly among younger Catholics who were increasingly skeptical of institutional claims and increasingly unwilling to accept official explanations that weren't backed by documentary evidence. Pope Paul VI, who served from 1963 to 1978, recognized this pressure, and he made a decision that seemed on its surface like a significant concession. In 1966, he authorized the publication of a multi-volume collection of documents from the Vatican archives related to the Second World War, a collection that would eventually be published under the title Actes et documents du Saint-Siège relatifs à la Seconde Guerre mondiale. And this collection was prepared by a team of Jesuit historians working under Vatican supervision, and it included diplomatic correspondence, internal memoranda, reports from papal nuncios in various countries, and other materials that had never been published before. And the Vatican presented this publication as proof of its willingness to open its records, to allow scholars to examine its wartime conduct, and to demonstrate that it had nothing to hide. But what happened next revealed the fundamental limitations of this approach, because as soon as the volumes began to appear, starting in 1965 and continuing through the 1970s, historians who examined them carefully began to notice problems, gaps in the chronology, references to documents that weren't included in the published collection, correspondence that seemed to be missing follow-up responses, and most tellingly, editorial notes that indicated certain passages had been omitted for reasons of confidentiality or diplomatic sensitivity. And these omissions were marked with ellipses or with phrases like "document not available for publication." And while the Vatican maintained that these omissions were minimal and didn't affect the overall integrity of the collection, critics pointed out that you couldn't verify that claim without seeing the original documents, and the original documents remained sealed in the Vatican secret archives, inaccessible to independent researchers. And so what the Vatican had done, in effect, was to create a curated selection of its own records, a selection that showed the Church in the most favorable possible light, or at least in a defensible light, and then presented that selection as if it were comprehensive, as if it represented the full archival record. And this approach satisfied some critics, particularly those who were inclined to give the Church the benefit of the doubt, but it enraged others, who saw it as a sophisticated form of historical manipulation, more insidious than outright secrecy because it created the appearance of transparency while actually reinforcing the Vatican's control over what could be known. The physical element that matters in this period is the expansion of the Vatican secret archives building itself, because in 1970, under Paul VI's direction, a new wing was added to the archive complex, a modernist concrete structure that contrasted sharply with the older 19th century building. And this new wing was designed to house materials from the 20th century as they gradually became accessible under the revised opening rules. And it included state-of-the-art climate control systems, fireproof storage vaults, and a new reading room equipped with microfilm readers, and eventually, in the late 1970s, with early computer terminals that allowed researchers to search digital catalogs. And this technological modernization was presented as evidence that the Vatican was moving toward international archival standards, that it was embracing transparency and scholarly access. But the architecture of the new wing also included features that reinforced control. The storage vaults were sealed with electronic locks that required both a physical key and a numeric code to open, meaning that even archive staff couldn't access materials without authorization from senior officials. The reading room was designed with security cameras, a new addition that allowed supervisors to monitor researchers remotely, and the entrance to the new wing was separated from the old building by a secure corridor with a guard station, meaning that researchers who were granted access to 20th century materials had to pass through an additional checkpoint, submit to additional identification procedures, and sign additional confidentiality agreements beyond what was required for earlier periods. The institutional mechanism that accompanied this physical expansion was a formal revision of the access rules, announced in 1978, which reduced the restriction period from 75 years to 70 years, a modest change that opened materials up to 1903 at that point. Still nowhere near the documents from Pius XV's pontificate or the Second World War, but it was presented as progress, as a sign of good faith, and it came with a new bureaucratic structure, the creation of a formal appeals process for researchers who were denied access to restricted materials. You could now submit a written appeal explaining why you needed to see specific documents, and that appeal would be reviewed by a committee of senior archivists and Vatican officials. And if your appeal was approved, you would be granted conditional access, meaning you could see the documents, but you would be required to sign an agreement that you would not publish direct quotations without prior approval, that you would submit your manuscript for review before publication, and that you would acknowledge in any published work that your research had been conducted with the cooperation of the Vatican Secret Archives. And this last requirement was particularly significant because it meant that any historian who wanted to work with restricted materials had to essentially endorse the Vatican's archival system, had to publicly associate themselves with it. And this created a professional incentive structure where challenging the system too openly meant losing access, while working cooperatively within the system meant gaining access to materials that could advance your career, enhance your reputation, and position you as an expert on Vatican history. The verifiable historical anchor here is the case of the American historian John Cornwell, who in the 1990s was granted unusual access to Vatican archives for the purpose of writing a biography of Pius X, and Cornwell went into the project believing that he would be able to defend Pius X against his critics, that the archival evidence would show that the Pope had done more to resist Nazi atrocities than was generally known. But what Cornwell found, as he worked through the materials he was allowed to see, was a more complicated and in some ways more damaging picture. A picture of a pope who was deeply concerned with diplomatic protocol, who was cautious to the point of paralysis, who prioritized the institutional interests of the Church over moral action. And Cornwell's book, published in 1999 under the title Hitler's Pope, was highly critical. It argued that Pius XIV's silence in the face of the Holocaust was not just a failure of courage, but a moral catastrophe. And the publication of this book created a crisis for the Vatican because Cornwell had been granted access precisely because Vatican officials believed he would write a sympathetic account, and instead he had written a condemnation, and the Vatican's response was revealing. Officials didn't dispute the accuracy of the documents Cornwell had cited. They couldn't, because those documents were real. They were in the archive. But they argued that Cornwell had misinterpreted them, that he had taken quotations out of context, that he had failed to consider other documents that would have provided a more complete picture, and when other historians asked to see those other documents to verify the Vatican's counter-argument, they were told that those materials were still restricted, still covered by confidentiality rules, still unavailable for independent research, and so the debate became impossible to resolve definitively, because the Vatican could always claim that the full truth was more complicated than what Cornwell had presented, but they wouldn't actually let anyone else see the materials that would prove or disprove that claim. And this standoff, this situation where accusations were made based on partial documentation and defenses were offered based on undisclosed documentation, became the new normal for Vatican historical controversies, a state of permanent ambiguity where nothing could be proven conclusively because the evidence remained under the Vatican's control. You're approaching the final turn now. And what you need to understand about the late 20th and early 21st century is that the Vatican finally began to recognize that the old system, the system built on selective access and controlled disclosure, was becoming unsustainable, not because the Church had suddenly embraced transparency as a principle, but because the cost of maintaining the restrictions was beginning to outweigh the benefits. Because every controversy that emerged, every accusation that couldn't be fully investigated because the documents remained sealed, did more damage to the Church's credibility than releasing the documents would have done. And this calculation, this pragmatic recognition that secrecy had become more dangerous than openness, led to a series of decisions in the early 2000s that represented the most significant change in Vatican archival policy since Leo XIII's original opening in 1881. The key moment came in 2002 when Pope John Paul II, who had served since 1978 and who had lived through the Second World War himself, who understood the historical questions surrounding Pius XII because he had heard them repeatedly throughout his pontificate, announced that the restriction period would be reduced again, this time from 70 years to 60 years, and that furthermore, materials from certain pontificates could be opened earlier if they were deemed to be of particular historical importance. And the pontificate he specifically mentioned was that of Pius XV, who had served from 1922 to 1939, whose papers included correspondence with Mussolini, with German bishops during the rise of Nazism, with Vatican diplomats who had warned about the dangers of fascism and anti-Semitism, and these papers were opened in 2003, more than a decade ahead of when they would have become available under the normal 60-year rule. And this early opening was presented as a gesture of good faith, a demonstration that the Vatican was willing to allow scholars to examine controversial periods. But what's important to understand is that this decision was not made in isolation. It was made in the context of a broader crisis facing the Church. The sexual abuse scandal that had exploded into public view in 2002 with revelations from Boston and other dioceses in the United States. Revelations that showed systematic cover-ups, that showed bishops moving abusive priests from parish to parish, rather than reporting them to authorities, that showed a pattern of institutional protection that prioritized the Church's reputation over the safety of children. And these revelations raised immediate questions about what the Vatican had known, when it had known it, what instructions it had given to bishops around the world, and whether there were documents in the Vatican archives that would show a pattern of deliberate policy, of instructions to conceal abuse, to protect abusers, to silence victims. And these questions couldn't be answered because materials from the late 20th century were still sealed, still protected by the 60-year rule. But the pressure to open them was immense, and the decision to open Pius V's papers early was, in part, an attempt to demonstrate that the Vatican was capable of transparency, that it could release sensitive materials even when those materials might be embarrassing or controversial. And the implicit message was that if the Church was willing to open papers from the Nazi era, papers that dealt with the Holocaust and fascism, then it could be trusted to eventually open papers from the abuse crisis as well. Though, of course, that opening wouldn't happen for decades, not until the 60-year rule had run its course. The physical element that defines this period is the creation of a digital archive project, begun in 2005 under Pope Benedict XVI, who had been elected in 2005 after John Paul II's death, and Benedict, who had been a professor of theology before his ecclesiastical career, who understood academic research, who had himself worked in archives, authorized a major digitization initiative that would scan millions of pages of documents from the Vatican Secret archives and make them available through a searchable online database. And this project was presented as a revolution, as the Vatican finally entering the digital age, finally making its collections accessible to scholars around the world who couldn't afford to spend months in Rome, who couldn't navigate the Italian bureaucracy, who couldn't secure the letters of recommendation and institutional support that had always been required for physical access. But the digitization project, like every previous archival initiative, came with built-in controls because the decision about which documents to digitize, which collections to prioritize, which time periods to include was made by Vatican officials, not by an independent commission, not by consultation with the international scholarly community. And what got digitized first were the least controversial materials: medieval papal correspondence, administrative records from the Renaissance, diplomatic papers from the 18th and 19th centuries, materials that were historically important but that didn't touch on any of the sensitive questions about the modern Church. And when researchers asked when 20th century materials would be digitized, they were told that those materials would be added to the database eventually, once they had been properly cataloged, once conservation work had been completed, once the appropriate permissions had been secured. And these explanations were always vague, always open-ended, and the timeline kept getting pushed back. And what this meant was that even as the Vatican claimed to be embracing digital access, the actual effect was to create two tiers of availability: older materials that were increasingly accessible through digital means, and modern materials that remained accessible only through the traditional application process, the physical travel to Rome, the supervision in the reading room, all the mechanisms of control that had been in place for more than a century. The institutional mechanism that emerged during this period was something that Vatican archivists began to call the case-by-case approach, which meant that instead of having fixed rules about what could and couldn't be accessed, the archives would consider each research request individually, evaluating the researcher's credentials, the nature of their project, the potential sensitivity of the materials they wanted to see, and the broader context of public discussion about the Church. And this approach gave the Vatican maximum flexibility because it meant they could grant access when it served their interests, when they believed the research would produce favorable results, or when denying access would create more controversy than granting it, and they could deny access when they felt the research might be damaging, or when they simply didn't trust the researcher's intentions. And this flexibility was presented as a virtue, as a more nuanced and sophisticated approach than rigid chronological restrictions, but it also meant that access decisions became even more opaque, even harder to predict or appeal, because there were no clear standards, no published criteria, just the discretionary judgment of archive officials who were accountable only to the Vatican hierarchy, not to any external review process or scholarly oversight body. The verifiable historical anchor for this period is the announcement made by Pope Francis in 2019 that the archives of Pius XIV's pontificate would be opened in 2020, a full decade ahead of when they would have become available under the 60-year rule, because Pius XIV died in 1958. And 60 years from that would have been 2018, but the archives weren't fully cataloged and prepared until 2020. And Francis's decision to open them was presented as a historic moment, as the Church finally allowing full scholarly access to the most controversial pontificate of the modern era, the pontificate that had been the subject of debate, accusation, and defense for more than half a century. And researchers from around the world applied for access. Hundreds of applications were submitted in the months before the scheduled opening in March 2020. And then just as the archives were about to open, the COVID-19 pandemic began, and Rome went into lockdown, and the Vatican closed not just the archives, but all of its offices and facilities, and the opening was postponed. And when the archives finally did reopen in early 2021 with limited capacity and strict health protocols, the number of researchers who could actually access the materials was drastically reduced. And the backlog of applications meant that many scholars who had planned to begin research in 2020 didn't actually get access until 2022 or 2023. And by that time, some of the momentum, some of the public attention that had focused on the opening had dissipated, and the initial wave of research that emerged from the Pius XIII archives, published in 2022 and 2023, was more fragmentary, more provisional than it would have been if scholars had been able to work systematically and collaboratively from the beginning. And this delay, while not deliberately engineered by the Vatican, nevertheless had the effect of softening the impact of the opening, of making it harder for researchers to quickly produce comprehensive assessments of Pius XII's record, and the Vatican's own historians, who had continued access throughout the pandemic, who weren't subject to the same restrictions and delays as outside researchers, were able to publish their interpretations first, were able to frame the narrative before independent scholars had time to fully examine the materials. And this sequence, this timing, whether intentional or not, once again demonstrated how control over access translates into control over interpretation. Because even when documents are eventually opened, the conditions of that opening, the timing, the procedures, the capacity limitations, all of these factors shape what can be discovered and how quickly it can be brought to public attention. The real consequence of this entire period, from the early 2000s through the opening of the Pius XV archives, was that it exposed the fundamental tension at the heart of the Vatican's archival policy. The tension between the Church's claim to moral authority, which requires historical honesty and accountability, and its institutional interest in self-preservation, which requires control over information that might be damaging. And this tension can never be fully resolved because every decision to open materials raises questions about why they were closed for so long. And every decision to keep materials closed raises questions about what they contain and why the Church is afraid to reveal them. And so, the Vatican finds itself in a paradoxical situation where the very act of managing its archives, of deciding what to open and when to open it, becomes evidence of the thing it's trying to avoid, evidence that the Church has something to hide, that its historical record requires management and spin rather than simple disclosure. And this paradox has become more acute in the digital age, where information leaks more easily, where Vatican documents sometimes appear on WikiLeaks or in journalistic exposés before they're officially opened, where the contrast between the Church's controlled archival releases and the uncontrolled circulation of information outside its walls makes the whole system of managed access seem increasingly anachronistic, increasingly out of step with contemporary expectations about transparency and institutional accountability. And yet the system persists because it's built into the institutional structure of the Vatican, because the people who run the archives are trained in a culture of discretion and control, because the hierarchy that oversees them still believes, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that some truths are better managed than revealed, and because changing the system would require admitting that it was wrong, that the decisions made by Leo XIII and his successors, the decisions that shaped more than a century of controlled access and selective disclosure, were not acts of responsible stewardship, but acts of institutional self-protection that distorted the historical record and undermined the Church's credibility. And that admission, that acknowledgement of institutional failure, is something the Vatican has never been willing to make, not explicitly, not in a way that would require systemic reform, rather than incremental adjustment. And so the system continues, evolving, adapting, becoming more sophisticated in some ways and more vulnerable in others, but never fundamentally changing. Never surrendering the core principle that information about the Church is the Church's property, to be managed, controlled, and revealed according to the Church's judgment about what serves its interests. And that principle, established in 1881 and maintained ever since, is the decision that quietly rewrote Church record-keeping, not by destroying documents or denying that history happened, but by controlling the infrastructure through which history is accessed, interpreted, and understood. You've come this far, and now we're at the end, and what you need to understand in this final part is not just what happened in the past, but what's happening right now, today, in 2025, because the system we've been tracing, the system that began with Leo XIII's decision in 1881, hasn't ended. It's still operating, still shaping what can be known about the Catholic Church's history, and it's doing so in ways that are both more subtle and more consequable than ever before. Because we're living in a moment when the tension between institutional control and public demand for transparency has reached a breaking point, when the old mechanisms of managed access are colliding with new technologies, new forms of information distribution, new expectations about accountability, and the Vatican is trying to navigate this collision without fundamentally changing its approach, trying to appear modern and open while preserving the core structures of control that have defined its archival policy for more than a century. The current state of the Vatican Archives, now officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019, a name change that was supposed to signal a break from the old secret designation, even though the Latin term secretum had always meant private rather than hidden, reflects this ongoing tension, because the archives today operate with a complex hybrid system. There are materials that are fully open and digitally accessible, materials from medieval and early modern periods that have been scanned and uploaded to online databases. There are materials that are partially open, available for consultation in the physical reading rooms in Rome, but not yet digitized. And there are materials that remain completely restricted. Materials from the late 20th century and early 21st century that fall under various confidentiality rules, diplomatic protocols, and what the Vatican calls pastoral sensitivity considerations. And this last category, pastoral sensitivity, is particularly revealing because it's become the catch-all justification for withholding documents that don't fit neatly into the chronological restriction periods. Documents that deal with ongoing legal cases, with abuse allegations, with financial irregularities, with internal church politics, and the definition of what constitutes pastoral sensitivity is determined entirely by Vatican officials. There's no external review, no appeal process that involves anyone outside the church hierarchy. And this means that even as the Vatican opens archives from the 1950s and prepares to open materials from the 1960s, it simultaneously maintains the ability to seal away contemporary documents that might be far more relevant to current controversies, current accountability debates, current demands for transparency from abuse survivors, from financial regulators, from law enforcement agencies investigating criminal conduct by clergy. The physical element that defines this current moment is not a single room or building, but a network, a distributed system that includes the traditional archive buildings in Vatican City, the digital servers that host the online databases, the diocesan archives scattered around the world that hold local records but operate under Vatican guidelines, and increasingly the personal devices, the laptops and phones and cloud storage accounts where Vatican officials keep their correspondence, their meeting notes, their internal communications, because the nature of record-keeping has changed fundamentally in the digital age, and the Vatican has been slow to adapt its archival policies to this new reality. There's no comprehensive policy about how digital communications should be preserved, no clear guidelines about which emails and text messages and WhatsApp conversations constitute official records that should be archived. And this ambiguity creates enormous opportunities for selective preservation, for the deletion of inconvenient records, for the claim, when questions are asked years later, that certain communications simply don't exist anymore, that they were never saved, that they've been lost in computer crashes or system migrations or routine data purges. And these claims are nearly impossible to verify or disprove, because unlike physical documents that leave a material trace even when destroyed, digital records can vanish completely, can be wiped from existence with no evidence that they ever existed. And this creates a new form of archival control that's far more absolute than anything Leo III could have imagined, because it operates at the level of creation rather than access. The question is no longer what documents researchers are allowed to see. The question is what documents exist at all, what gets saved and what gets deleted. And those decisions are being made every day in real time by Vatican officials who may not even think of themselves as making archival decisions, who are just managing their inboxes, clearing out old files, but who are in effect determining what future historians will and won't be able to know about how the Church operated in the early 21st century. The institutional mechanism that governs all of this is what Vatican insiders call the need-to-know principle, which has always existed informally but which has become more explicitly codified in recent years, particularly in response to leaks, to unauthorized disclosures of Vatican documents, the most famous being the VatiLeaks scandal in 2012 when Pope Benedict XVI's personal butler leaked confidential papers to journalists, revealing internal conflicts, financial mismanagement, and power struggles within the Vatican bureaucracy. And the Vatican's response to that scandal was not to become more transparent, not to address the issues the leaked documents revealed, but to tighten information security, to implement new protocols about document handling, to restrict access even further, to create a culture where sharing information, even internally, even among Vatican officials who might have legitimate reasons to know what's happening in other departments, is treated as a potential security breach. And this culture of compartmentalization, of information silos, means that even Vatican archivists themselves often don't have a complete picture of what materials exist, where they're stored, or what restrictions govern them, because different offices maintain their own records according to their own systems. And there's no central registry, no master catalog that includes everything. and when researchers ask to see documents from a particular Vatican department or congregation, they're told that those materials aren't part of the Vatican Apostolic Archives. They're held separately by the office that created them, and they're subject to that office's own access policies, which may be more restrictive than the general archival rules, or which may not exist in any written form at all, just informal practices, institutional customs, decisions made case by case based on who's asking and why. The verifiable historical anchor for understanding where we are now is the ongoing investigation into clerical sexual abuse, which has become the defining crisis of the contemporary Catholic Church, and which has exposed more clearly than any previous controversy the gap between the Vatican's claims about transparency and the reality of how it handles documentation. Because in country after country, in diocese after diocese, investigations by law enforcement, by grand juries, by government commissions have revealed that church officials kept detailed records of abuse allegations, of complaints against priests, of decisions to transfer abusers rather than report them to police. And these records existed, they were in diocesan archives, in bishops' files, in personnel records, but they were never made available to victims, never disclosed to civil authorities, never acknowledged publicly until they were discovered through legal processes, through subpoenas and search, warrants and court orders, and in many cases, even after their existence became known, church officials claimed that they couldn't release the full records because of confidentiality obligations, because of canon law restrictions, because of concern for the privacy of individuals mentioned in the documents. And these claims have been tested in courts around the world, and in many cases, they've been rejected. Judges have ordered dioceses to turn over documents, have held bishops in contempt for failing to comply, have imposed penalties on church institutions that continue to withhold records. But the Vatican itself, Vatican City as a sovereign entity, remains largely immune to these legal processes because it's a separate state, because it doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of national courts, because it can refuse to cooperate with investigations and there's no mechanism to compel it. And this immunity, this ability to stand apart from the legal accountability that applies to every other institution in democratic societies, is the ultimate expression of the principle that Leo X established in 1881. The principle that the Church's records belong to the Church, that access is a privilege the Church grants rather than a right that others can claim, and that the Church's judgment about what should be revealed and what should remain confidential takes precedence over any external demand, any legal requirement, any moral obligation to victims or to the public. The real consequence of all of this, the consequence that matters for understanding what the Vatican decision of 1881 actually means in 2025, is that it created a template for institutional opacity that has proven extraordinarily durable, extraordinarily adaptable, because the specific mechanisms have changed over time. The 75-year rule became the 60-year rule. Physical catalogs became digital databases. Formal restrictions became pastoral sensitivity considerations. But the underlying principle has remained constant. The principle that information is power, that controlling information means controlling interpretation, controlling narrative, controlling reputation, and that an institution that wants to survive across centuries, that wants to maintain authority in the face of scandals and controversies and challenges to its legitimacy, must control its own historical record, must never surrender the ability to decide what can be known and when it can be known. And the Vatican has never surrendered that ability. Not in 1881, not in 1966, not in 2020, not today. And the question that historians are left with, the question that anyone who wants to understand the Catholic Church's actual history, rather than its official history as to confront, is how do you write history when the archive itself is an interested party? When the institution that holds the documents is also the institution that benefits from controlling what those documents reveal, when every act of archival access is also an act of institutional management, and the answer that most historians have arrived at, reluctantly, sometimes after years of working within the Vatican system, is that you can't write definitive history under these conditions. You can write provisional history. You can write interpretive history. You can write history that acknowledges its own limitations, that makes clear what sources were available and what sources were not. That distinguishes between what can be documented and what remains speculation, but you cannot write the kind of authoritative, comprehensive, fully evidenced history that the discipline aspires to because the evidence is incomplete, selectively preserved, strategically disclosed. And there's no way to know what you're missing, no way to assess the significance of the gaps, no way to determine whether the documents you're allowed to see are representative of what existed or whether they're the documents that survived a filtering process designed to shape your conclusions. And this epistemological problem, this fundamental uncertainty about the completeness and reliability of the historical record, is Leo XIII's legacy. It's what his decision in 1881 actually created. Not transparency, but the appearance of transparency. Not access, but controlled access. Not an open archive, but a managed archive. And that management, that control, continues today, continues to shape what we know and what we don't know about one of the world's oldest and most influential institutions, and it will continue into the future because the system is self-perpetuating, because the people who run it believe in it, because changing it would require acknowledging that it was wrong. And institutions, especially institutions that claim divine authority, especially institutions that have survived for 2,000 years, do not easily acknowledge that they were wrong, do not easily surrender power, do not easily choose transparency over control, and so the archive remains in its new building with its digital catalogs, with its reformed access policies, with its papal pronouncements about openness and dialogue. But beneath all of that, beneath the modernization and the rhetoric and the incremental reforms, the fundamental structure persists. The structure that says the church decides, the church controls, the church determines what history will say about the church. And that structure, established in 1881, refined over decades, adapted to new technologies and new challenges, remains the quiet decision that rewrote church record-keeping not by destroying the past, but by controlling access to it, not by denying history, but by managing how history would be known. And in doing so, it ensured that the Vatican secrets, the real ones, the ones that matter, would remain secrets not because they're locked away in some hidden room, though some of them are, but because the system itself, the entire infrastructure of catalogs and restrictions and access policies and bureaucratic procedures, is designed to make certain questions difficult to ask, certain connections difficult to trace, certain patterns difficult to see, and that design, that system, that quiet architecture of institutional control is still there, still functioning, still shaping what we can know about the Catholic Church, and it will be there long after everyone involved in creating it is gone, because it's no longer dependent on any individual decision or any particular pope's policy. It's become institutional culture. It's become the way things are done, and changing it would require not just a policy reform, but a revolution in how the Church understands its relationship to its own past, its own truth, its own accountability, and that revolution has not happened yet, and there's no clear sign that it will happen anytime soon. And so here we are, at the end of this story, and you've followed it all the way through, from that decision in 1881 to the present moment, and maybe you understand now how something that seemed like an opening, like a gesture of transparency, was actually the beginning of a sophisticated system of control, a system that worked precisely because it didn't look like control, because it looked like cooperation, like scholarly access, like institutional openness. And maybe you're lying there now, thinking about what it means that we still don't have the full story, that there are documents in Vatican storage rooms, in digital archives, in filing cabinets, in diocesan offices around the world. Documents that would change what we know about church history, about abuse cover-ups, about financial corruption, about political collaborations. And those documents exist, they're real, they're sitting somewhere, but we can't see them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Not unless the institution, that created them decides to let us see them, and that's the reality we live with. That's the consequence of the decision we've been tracing tonight. If you're still listening, if you've stayed with me through all of this, I want to thank you. These stories take time to tell properly, and I'm grateful you gave me yours. If this is the kind of history that interests you, the kind that goes deeper than the surface, that tries to understand not just what happened, but how the systems that shaped what happened actually worked, then maybe you'd like to subscribe to Tales of Vatican Secrets. We share a new story every single day, different topics, different periods, but always focused on the real mechanisms, the real documents, the real decisions that made the Church what it is. And if tonight's story felt valuable to you, if you learned something you didn't know before, it would mean a lot if you'd take a moment to like the video. It's a small thing, but it helps other people find these stories, and these are stories that deserve to be found. I'll be back tomorrow night with something new, and I hope you'll be here to listen. Until then, rest well, and thank you for walking through this with me.